European Union side, we've finally seen the European Commission acknowledge that changes can and even must be made to its operation. Government pressure and your clear articulation of the problems faced by the people and businesses of Northern Ireland, who are part of the UK, have, I believe, played an important part in bringing the Commission to the negotiating table. The withdrawal agreement itself on the 19th of October 2019 recognised both our sovereignty and the autonomy of our legal order, together with our third country status. We passed Section 38(2)(b) of the Withdrawal Act and the repeal of the 1972 Act, European Communities Act, including Section 3, which deals with the Court of Justice. This is not to mention that the EU is only an observer in the United Nations, whereas we have sovereign status. I must be frank, minor changes or superficial or insufficiently clear legal text as to how the protocol operates will not suffice. Without fundamental amendment, I do not see a way in which it can persist and be anything other than disruptive to trade, democracy, and ultimately to the sovereignty of the United Kingdom. We will focus on why this afternoon. Over the next hour, we will ask you about government plans for how the protocol could or should operate, including removing the European Court, its case law and principles from its purview, and applicability as to European Union law in relation to Northern Ireland. Also limiting the significant amount of red tape and bureaucracy faced by businesses in Great Britain when trading with counterparts in Northern Ireland. Time permitting, we will also ask you about other aspects of UK-EU relations, focusing on the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and its specialised committees, fishing rights and Gibraltar. I believe that we have met your officials before, but for those watching at home, would you kindly introduce us to her? And perhaps she could explain her responsibilities.
Thank you, Chair. It's very nice to be here before you and the committee, and to be here in person. It's very good to have that personal interaction at last. So, as you say, my co-witness is Susanna Simon, who is Director in the EU Secretariat, and perhaps I'll just let her say 2 or 3 sentences about her responsibilities.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm responsible for the implementation of the TCA as far as the economic and trade elements are concerned.
Thank you very much indeed. So I'm going to ask the first question, and then that's going to be in 2 parts, and then I'm going to move on to David Jones. So the question that I wish to put is this, Lord Frost. Is the government's position that, in the light of what I've just stated, that the European Court of Justice should no longer have any role in relation to the protocol? And what dispute resolution procedure would you propose in its place? How would you ensure the independence of arbitrators, and on what principles would they take their decisions, required, for example, in relation to CJEU case law? So that's the first question. Would you be kind enough to answer that one to begin with?
Yes, of course, Chair. So our position is, as set out in the command paper, that remains the expression of our position on all issues in this negotiation. And what we said in paragraph 41 was that we should look to normalise the governance basis for the protocol so that the relationship between the UK and the EU is not ultimately policed by the EU institutions, including the Court of Justice. And that's our position, and that's what we are taking into these negotiations. What we'd like to see instead, we think the most natural way forward, is an arbitration mechanism, which is normal in these sorts of treaties. It's exactly what we have in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And there's a lot of good custom and practice as to how arbitrators are appointed and to how these systems work. And I think the arrangements in the TCA are good arrangements from that point of view. We worked very hard on them all last year and would be a good model to follow in this case too.
Would that mean that the European Court principles and case law, which I referred to, would not somehow or other slip in, as I said in my opening remarks, on the basis of some kind of legal interpretation, the legal text, which would then fudge the issue, and we'd then find that actually, although we thought that we escaped the European Court of Justice, that in practice there would be disputes and arguments about the wording?
So we want to avoid that situation, clearly, and we're not interested in arrangements which keep the court in by some other name at one remove or in some other way. It's highly unusual in an international treaty to have disputes settled in the court of one of the parties, and that is the fundamental principle that we take into this, and the fundamental thing we need to remove from the arrangements going forward.
That couldn't be clearer. Now, how could Section 38 of the EU Withdrawal Act 2020, guaranteeing UK sovereignty, be used in the event of a continued dispute between the UK and EU over the operation of the protocol? I mentioned Section 38(2)b had a little bit to do with this, and I'd be very interested to know what your reaction to it is now.
So I think, Section 38 is useful for all kinds of purposes to us, and not just in this particular context. It's obviously, I guess you would say, a codification of what has always been understood to be the case, but it's very important for the avoidance of doubt provision that the UK Parliament is sovereign, that the UK Parliament is the final arbiter within the UK, and that is a very important statement of principle which we can take into these disputes, or indeed to any other. So I think it's incredibly useful to have it there. And in particular, it makes clear that the direct effect-like arrangements that are in the Withdrawal Act that give implementation to the withdrawal agreement and the protocol have to be read in that context. They can't be read in their own right. They have to be seen through the prism of Section 38, which, let's not forget, was voted through by a very wide majority in Parliament.
Not only in the Commons, but actually went through without any comment to speak of, or at all, in the House of Lords.
Exactly.
One further point on that, of course, is that 38(2)b actually specifically refers to direct applicability and direct effect, and it is notwithstanding the arrangements set out in the protocol and the withdrawal agreement. Yes. So that for practical purposes it does provide, for British domestic legal purposes, an override of both the withdrawal agreement and the protocol were it necessary to use it by way of further primary legislation. Would that not be correct?
So I think it has always been the case, and Section 38 makes it abundantly clear that this Parliament can make or unmake any law within the United Kingdom, and that is clear, and that fact has consequences.
And one last point on this, which is that, in fact, I had a letter in the Times only a few days ago in which I made clear that, quoting Lord Bingham, one of our greatest judges, that this would be the case in terms of providing for parliamentary sovereignty in respect of all matters, including even if it was in respect of the rule of law, so that, as far as he was concerned, the whole question of parliamentary sovereignty comes first, as you just described. Thank you very much indeed. David Jones, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I wonder if I could just press Lord Frost slightly on one of the answers he gave you. And you'll be aware, Lord Frost, that there was a report in the Times last week suggesting that the government might be softening its position on the role of the European Court of Justice by allowing it some sort of vestigial interpretive role. The following day, there was an article in the Telegraph which said that was effectively a load of nonsense. Was it a load of nonsense?
So there's all kinds of speculation around our position, and there has been for the last 2 or 3 weeks. I mean, we've tried to make it clear, and the position in the command paper is authoritative, that we can't have the Court of Justice settling disputes between us in this protocol in future. And as I said, we're not interested in the court sort of by another name or by another route. It must be, I think the principle, probably most important principle, is that it's one of equality. That's what we put into the TCA. Two equal sovereign entities with an equal arbitration mechanism that settles disputes fairly between the two parties. And that seems to us the best way forward in this case as well.
No role whatever for the European Court of Justice.
So no role for the court as the final arbiter of disputes, as the summit of a system that imposes EU law. No role for the direct settlement of disputes between us, yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to talk about the Act of Union 1800. This, of course, may be sub judice to a certain extent, so I'd like to skirt around that if at all possible. But what is your assessment of arguments that the protocol conflicts with UK domestic law in the shape of Article 6 of the Act of Union, which of course does provide for unfettered trade in both directions between Great Britain and Ireland, or Northern Ireland now?
So, as you say, this is a matter that's sub judice, I think, and I think court proceedings in the Court of Appeal are imminent or relatively imminent on that. So I don't want to say anything that would get in the way of that, and I don't think it'd be right to do so. Our position, having said that, has been that the protocol is compatible with the Act of Union, and we've set out arguments for that in the court case so far, and that is probably about as far as I'd better go without getting into arguments that are better settled in the court.
And of course, the Article 6 of the Act of Union not only provides for unfettered mutual trade, but also provides that in all treaties with any foreign power, His Majesty's subjects of Ireland shall have the same privileges and be on the same footing as His Majesty's subjects of Great Britain. That presumably is a matter that you're very well aware of.
Indeed, and as I say, the arguments are set out, and I probably best not go into them here, but you're correct in what you say.
Thank you.
Richard Jacks, please.
Well, Professor, good afternoon. Nice to see you. Aside from dispute resolution, how satisfied are you with the proposals that the Commission has put forward in areas of medicines, governance, customs and food safety checks? Do you accept that these are areas that need to be addressed in order to resolve the issues that have arisen? Is anything missing from the set of plans put forward, aside from the dispute resolution? I think that'll do for the moment. It's part 3, but I'll come to that in a second.
So obviously there's a negotiation underway on these proposals and on ours. So I don't want to say too much that gets in the way of that. Having said that, I think there are things to welcome in the Commission proposals, and there are things that are problematic. The things that to welcome, I think, are the fact that they have moved on from the position they took at the start of the year, which is that the only thing to do was to implement the protocol and that would solve all of the problems. It's now understood on both sides that there are problems with the current situation, and to be fair to them, the Commission proposals do for the first time acknowledge that they might be ready to change their own laws in order to deal with the special situation in Northern Ireland, and that's a very welcome admission, because we aren't going to get to a solution without that being understood clearly. The problem with them is that they don't go far enough. We are still, I think it's fair to say, trying to understand all the technical detail behind them and how they see them working. I'm not sure they would quite deliver the kind of ambitious freeing up of trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland that we want to see. But what we're trying to test is whether they could found the basis to go further than what they've put on the table. So that's the kind of discussion that we're having. And it has been quite constructive so far, but the gaps between us remain significant, and there's a lot of working through to go. To answer your question, the other part of your question, I mean, goods, SPS, stroke agri-food, medicines are certainly important issues in this. They're not the only problem areas for us. Governance, obviously, in terms of the courts and dispute settlement, as you say, is an important part of it. I would say the state aid provisions in Article 10 are also an issue for us, and there are, I guess you might say, important consequentials to these arrangements like VAT and excise that also need to be worked through. So I think we would frame the question quite a lot more widely than the Commission have so far. But that doesn't mean we can't talk about it. Indeed, we are, and let's see how far we can get.
Bearing in mind the EU rarely go far enough, in my experience certainly, and I suspect yours. What's the likely outcome? The only outcome I can see is we are going to have to leave the protocol completely, regain the independence of our island, which is what we voted to do, and sort of crack on as the United Kingdom, which of course was the intention in the first place. Can you assure me that there'll be no watering down? I know you've hinted that, I think the chairman's hinted that, but can you assure us here that there'll be no watering down so far as the United Kingdom is concerned in retaining the United Kingdom, which includes Northern Ireland?
Yes, I mean, this is one United Kingdom, and it's very important that we protect and sustain that, clearly. What I would say is that, which I've said before, is that it's the government's position that there always will need to be some sort of treaty arrangement between us and the EU that covers the special situation of Northern Ireland, because we want to preserve an open border, a border without infrastructure checks and controls. We want to support the Good Friday Agreement, as all sides do. So it's necessary that there be some special arrangements, I think, to make these sort of special circumstances work. And that's what we're trying to get to. It will be much better for stability, prosperity, certainty for everybody in Northern Ireland if we could reach an ambitious agreement with the EU that dealt with the problem, because then we could move on and everyone would know where they stand. So I'm still focusing on that. Obviously, as we've said, we think that the test for using Article 16 is passed, but we still would like to come to an agreed arrangement if we can, and that's what we're trying to do.
Lastly, Lord Frost, would you agree that the Commission's proposals still require a considerable degree of Northern Irish alignment with EU law?
So the Commission's proposals do not deal really with this question of direct imposition of EU law through the normal institutions of the EU in Northern Ireland. They provide for some limited exemptions to those for trade GB Northern Ireland, but as I've said, we would like to see it go much further, but they don't deal with the fundamental sort of parameters of how the system works. And I think our view is that you've got to deal with those fundamental parameters or you won't get something that's going to last.
Thank you.
I know Marco Longier would like to ask a question.
If I may, thank you. Thank you, Lord Frost. You made a statement just a few moments ago where you said that you believe that the test for invoking Article 15 has been passed and that you would prefer to resolve this through agreement. Are you able to say at what point and how long we would have to wait until you believe that we have an agreement? Is there some defined framework one could work to before we say, well, actually, no, now it's time to invoke?
So I think it's difficult to say. We have always been clear we don't want this situation to run on for a very long time, and to be fair to the Commission, they have said that as well. We all see this as an issue for this autumn, to be settled one way or the other. I think our test is do we still believe there is a possibility of bridging the gap between us? Obviously, if we conclude that it can't be bridged in the real world, then we're in a different situation. But we will try everything, and we are trying everything and exploring every avenue, so that if it comes to that conclusion, it was genuinely possible to reach no other conclusion, and therefore other routes had to be followed. So I think it's right to give it a little time and to allow the technical talks to take place that are taking place at the moment, and try very hard to see if we can bridge these gaps. I think it's a pity the Commission waited 3 months before coming up with its proposals from our command paper in July. That would obviously have given us a little bit more time, but there we are, and we work with the situation as it is.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anne-Marie Morris.
Thank you, Chairman. If I may, Lord Frost, then you're probably going to get fed up with each of us going back on some of the questions you've already been asked. But in response to Mr. Jones's question, which was asking for your confirmation that the court would have no role, period, in relation to the protocol going forwards, and your response said that the court have no role in any final determination. That is not the same thing as having no role, period, in a protocol. Are you able to confirm to me that the court will have no role, period, in the protocol?
So I think many people have been trying to sort of play on the words that we use to make them bear a meaning that they won't support, and to sort of explore nuances that I think don't exist. I think the position that's set out in the command paper is the fundamental one, which is that we can't have the court of one of the parties settling decisions and disputes between us, and that is I think a sort of relatively simple test, and it's one that we've got to come out of the end of this arrangement with. It's a fundamentally unbalanced arrangement, and we have to put in place arbitration arrangements that are balanced. And I think that's what we're trying to do, and really there's no more complexity in it, I would say, than that.
So, with regard to the court, does it have any other role in the protocol?
So I don't think that it does. It's in the EU's view, it's the apex of a system that imposes EU law, and that is why it is so problematic in the way that it works in the protocol. As far as the EU is concerned, it's part of a total system of how they make their laws work within the EU that is partially imposed in Northern Ireland, and it's that system which is sort of non-democratic, and it's that system which we've got to find a different way of working with, I would say, for the future.
Thank you, Lord Frost. With regard to the questions that Mr. Drax put to you, it's clear, and I think you're right, that this is not really just about governance, customs, food safety checks. It has to be about principle. Are you able to confirm that it is your intention in these negotiations to get to agreement on the fundamental principles rather than just these individual items? Because I have a concern that other issues will arise as time goes on, in particular if we diverge. And if that is not addressed now, then we leave a running sore for the future.
I think it's a very good question, and I think that I find it, it is intellectually possible to imagine a solution which deals with all the current difficulties, but leaves in place a system that just generates a set of further difficulties down the line and leaves us in the same place in a year or two. And, we've tried to say in the command paper that we want a solution that delivers stability and that can work for good, and that deals with the aspirations of everybody in Northern Ireland. So you're right. I don't think a total solution can be one that sets up future divergence. I think we have to find a way of dealing with that, and that's why we came up with this idea in the protocol, which is not a new idea, of dual circulation of goods in Northern Ireland, that to us seems to provide the sort of safety valve to avoid that becoming a problem in future, while still working with some of the aspirations that were in the original protocol. And that's one of the reasons why we say our proposals are a compromise, albeit an ambitious one, and not something that simply sweeps away the entire protocol and leaves everyone wondering what comes after it.
That's very helpful, Lord Frost. I wish you well with that challenge. Can I then move on more specifically to Article 16? How much of a threat really is it to the EU? And I guess the extent to which it is a real threat, they perceive it as such, is the specific safeguard measures that you're considering. So I wonder if you could elaborate on what those safeguard measures that you're considering might be. I'll read the second half of the complexity of Article 16. I think once I've allowed you a chance to respond on that. Thank you.
So I wouldn't want to go into too much detail on this, because it's part of the all the different factors that weigh on the discussions that we're trying to have. But if I look at Article 16, it's quite broadly drawn. It talks about safeguards to deal with serious economic, societal or environmental difficulties that are liable to persist or diversion of trade. And it doesn't really give much more detail beyond that. I think you have to be able to say that what you're taking is a safeguard against a situation that's arisen, and that it's something that is, to a reasonable person capable of being a safeguard against that problem. I think that is the kind of approach that should be taken to it, and I think it's the one that we will take. Having said that, there's a very significant political problem in Northern Ireland of all those natures, actually, as I just mentioned. And if we do take safeguard measures under Article 16, they'll have to deal with the significant problem that is there.
And there has been speculation in the press about what those safeguard measures might be. Are you going to comment on any of those as to their accuracy, or are you going to leave it that it's a blank sheet of paper?
I think I would rather leave the speculation to the speculators, as it were. I think we will have to deal with the situation as we find it if we get to a point when Article 16 seems to be the only possible course of action. It's got to be something that is capable of stabilising the situation, dealing with the political problem that exists with the protocol. And I think I probably don't want to say more than that at this point.
Let me ask you then, could you foresee a situation where invoking Article 16 would require changes to UK domestic law? Would, depending on the safeguarding measures applied, the UK Internal Market Act 2020 have to be amended?
So it depends, I think, is the answer. I think there obviously are provisions in the Withdrawal Act that provide for direct effect, simplifying massively, but provide for direct effect for the protocol, and therefore would provide for direct effect for measures under Article 16 as well. But that doesn't exclude that we might need, depending on what measures were taken, if we got that far, we might need secondary legislation to, change some aspects of our own rule for clarity, I guess. But it hugely depends on the measures that we take, how far-reaching they were, what we were trying to accomplish with them. So it's not a straightforward question, and it's hard to answer without going into detail about the sort of measures which for now I think it's best not to.
Under Article 16, effectively, should we choose to both trigger it and put in place specific safeguarding measures, then the other party has the right to take what they perceive to be mitigating action. Have you given some thought as to what that mitigating action could be? I suspect you may say, if I don't know what the safeguards are, I'm not going to tell you what the mitigation is going to be. But you must, in general terms, and it would be helpful, I think, for the committee to understand what sort of things might be capable, possible, or seen by the EU to be reasonable, in generic terms, by way of a response.
So, I mean, it is actually quite a complicated kind of international law question, and relates both to how the TCA and the withdrawal agreement work. So it is actually quite a complicated question. I think I would say that I would kind of hope that the EU would think twice before taking such measures. If we had to act under Article 16, as I say, it would be safeguards to preserve stability and prosperity in Northern Ireland. It is not obvious that kind of adding retaliation to that situation necessarily helps anybody. Both we and the EU are committed to supporting the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and to supporting stability and prosperity in Northern Ireland. So in that sense, it's not necessarily logical, even though it might be what happens, that they go down that road. I think it's for them. I mean, one can imagine all kinds of things, but I think it would depend on the situation at the time if we get that far, and the broader atmosphere between us. As we've seen, the EU is quite capable of talking about retaliation, totally disconnected from the Northern Ireland problem in respect of other issues. So that's just how it is.
Lord Frost, you've been very generous. Thank you.
David Jones wanted to ask another question.
Yes, very, very briefly, Lord Frost, you mentioned in reply just now that secondary legislation may be necessary if Article 16 is invoked. Are you contemplating any measures under Article 16 which might require primary legislation?
So, as I say, I think we have to wait and see what measures are required. I would like to preserve a degree of flexibility about how we use Article 16 and the extent of the measures that are possible within it. And the legislative sort of basis of such measures, would kind of vary. So I think I would possibly give away a little too much if I was to about our positions, if I was to answer that fully. All I would say is that it is possible that amendment of our own domestic legal order might be necessary to provide total clarity for economic actors in Northern Ireland in those circumstances.
Thank you.
On that question, you did actually answer gave a very clear answer on the question of the attitude of the EU, and you quite rightly described it as the apex for them in relation to the whole construction of the European Union. And of course, we have the current situation with regard to Poland, for example, and there are others, some in the wings. And the real question turns from the European Court of Justice's point of view as part of the EU institutions on certain case law, Van Genden Loos, Hannes Gesellschaft, the Costa case. These are very well understood assertions by the Court of Justice in relation to its override over constitutions, and therefore not only over laws but over the constitutions themselves. Seems to me that actually, in terms of the comparison between Poland on the one hand and other countries of a similar persuasion at the moment, that the Northern Ireland question actually is either equivalent or really, in many respects, a less difficult one to deal with than the whole of the constitution of Poland, for example. So I wonder if you might like to comment on that.
Yes, I think, first thing is that it's obviously interesting as a matter of kind of political science, if nothing else, to see the same kind of tensions rising in other member states to the ones that arose here over many years about the role of the court and the relationship with the domestic national legal order, and we see it in Poland. We've seen it in a sort of slightly different way in Germany, and of course my old friend Michel Barnier has put a foot in those waters as well recently. So I think there is something that is kind of fundamental to the way the EU works and national politics there. I think it's I personally think while the court's writ runs in Northern Ireland, it's perfectly reasonable for us to comment on these questions. Even though we don't want that to be the case, unfortunately it is the case, and it seems reasonable for us to have something to say on those debates if we need to, which I've just done. I think you're right. It's simpler in the sense that obviously the amount of EU law that is applied in Northern Ireland is sort of segregated. It isn't about the entire domestic national legal order. But in a way, the simplicity is part of the problem, because if you're a member state and you get into this sort of, you get into an infraction process, you get into the court, there are all sorts of other checks and balances in the system. Every other member state has lots and lots of issues at stake with the Commission and the court, and these things are often handled with that sort of checks and balances in mind. That's not the case in Northern Ireland. It's a simple imposition of the EU's legal order on a non-member state where none of the other checks and balances apply, and that's why it's so problematic compared to one of the 27.
And of course, they've recognised our third country status as well. But I'm going to move on, if I may, because I've got a question from Greg Smith, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you've alluded to some of the points in answers to other questions, but of course Article 16 is one way of looking at this, and it's a potential solution, but it is still caught up with the trappings of reasonable steps, and we all know how the word reasonable can be tested over many, many years, yet clearly we can see problems with the operation of the protocol right now. So without wanting to sound like one of the lower down options for the title of a Bond film, what if Article 16 is not enough?
So it's a hypothetical question, and we will have to see. We'll have to see what situation arises. I think Article 16 is quite a strong power. It's quite an unusual power in these sorts of treaty arrangements, and it's designed to deal with a situation of considerable political sensitivity and complexity in Northern Ireland, and that's why it's there. So I hope actually that negotiations will be enough. That's the first best in this, and to find a consensual solution. If we can't, Article 16 is the alternative, and that's where we're focusing our attention for now if negotiations fail.
But is there I hate to use the term plan B, but if we do get to that point where Article 16 has been invoked, that as best as you can negotiate, and if I may say so, you've done a pretty good job negotiating thus far, if what you can negotiate is still causing supply chain issues, is still causing problems in Northern Ireland on the ground, is the government keeping options beyond Article 16 open?
So, I mean, I don't think any government ever rules anything out where it's a question of the territorial integrity of the country, which this is, and it will be irresponsible to do likewise. But I suppose I might argue that if the situation you describe arose, then it would be a sign. You could argue that it was a sign that more safeguards were needed. The safeguards had not worked, and therefore further safeguard type action was needed. I mean, I'm struggling slightly because there are so many hypotheticals between now and then, but I think Article 16 is a power which is designed to stabilise the situation and deal with some of the harmful consequences that could arise from it. And if you haven't removed those consequences, then I guess it would still be usable. But we're a long way ahead of where we are now.
I appreciate it. It was very hypothetical. Thank you.
Just one thought on that, if I may. Is it not the case that if you were to apply the same criteria, shall we say, to Russia or to China or even to the United States, and you took the same position in relation to third country status, in relation to the EU, you get a very swift answer from all three countries. Is that not the case?
I'm sure that is correct. Yeah.
So, that may put it in some sort of perspective, perhaps. The next question, Margaret Ferrier, please.
Thank you, Chair. Lord Frost, our committee published a report today on the UK's contributions to the EU budget after Brexit, including the UK's participation in certain EU programmes like Horizon Europe and Copernicus. What is the state of play of the UK's participation in these programmes, which was provisionally agreed as part of the TCA but is yet to be finalised?
Well, it's not a very happy state of play, as you identified in the committee's report, and we're sorry about that. It was agreed at the end of last year that we would be able to participate in Horizon, Copernicus, and so on. And the only reason it wasn't finalised sort of fully at the time was because the EU had not put in place its own legislation at the time. So we were waiting for that to happen, and it has now happened, and there's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be fully part of Horizon. And indeed, the EU has put in place these arrangements for Norway, for Iceland, and for the Ukraine. So there's no reason why it shouldn't be the case for us. We are getting quite concerned about this, actually. There is an obligation in Article 710 of the TCA to finalise our participation. It uses the word shall, and it's an obligation. Every day's delay is a further day when UK entities can't participate. Obviously, we're not paying into the pot either. But it would obviously be a breach of the treaty if the EU doesn't deliver on this obligation in Article 710 or delays excessively in doing so that our participation becomes less worthwhile. And I think it does raise questions of good faith now, as far as we're concerned. We have waited quite a long time and not made a great deal of this in the hope that it would fall into place, but it is now the best part of a year. UK entities can't participate, and the EU is depriving itself of the big net contribution that we would otherwise be making. So it's hard to see why they would do that if it wasn't for, if there isn't wider politics behind this.
The assessment by the President of the Royal Society, Sir Adrian Smith, he described it, the uncertainty as a really serious problem relating not just to funding but to the ability to attract scientific talent. So do you accept how frustrating these delays are, both to businesses and UK researchers? And why is the EU delaying, especially if they're not getting the money for these programmes?
So it is incredibly frustrating, and obviously tenders for all these projects are going on, and our entities can't participate in them. And perhaps there will come a point where the value for money case for this looks less compelling than it did at the start of the year. We're not at that point yet, and not close to it, but it could happen if there are endless delays here. I have raised this with Maros Šefčovič, and we raise it kind of all the time, and I haven't really had a clear answer as to why it's happening. I can guess, but nobody's kind of explained it fully to me. The one specialised committee, which Susanna's, for all of which Susanna's responsible, the one specialised committee which the Commission have not set a date for is the one on union programmes, and that is part of the problem.
Thank you. Marco Longi, please.
Thank you, Lord Frost. How do you respond to criticism by the French Maritime Minister that the UK has contravened the Trade and Cooperation Agreement in its issuing of licences to EU vessels to fish in UK waters, including those around Jersey? And could I also ask, what engagement have you had with the Commission in developing a system to issue licences in UK waters, including those around Jersey?
So, to be honest, we're sort of slightly frustrated by this. The situation is that we have granted 98% of the license applications that have come to us, and the current dispute relates to a very small number of boats under 12 metres in our 6 to 12 mile limit or around Jersey and Guernsey. And we believe, we've put in place perfectly clear criteria for granting those licences. The clear criterion in the TCA is that you have to have fished in those waters previously. And if you can prove that you have, we'll give a licence. And if you can't, we won't. And we've been very, I think, generous with the kind of evidence that we're willing to accept on that. And we are absolutely open to receiving more evidence. And indeed, last week or the week before, when we were supplied more evidence for 3 vessels, 3 French vessels in the 6 to 12 mile limit, we granted licences. So, and we can carry on doing that if the evidence comes forward. But there must be evidence, otherwise it's not in line with the treaty. So, we are a little frustrated in that we are acting in accordance with the treaty and not perhaps getting the credit for that. We are in a process with the Commission and the French and the Jersey authorities at the moment in slightly different configurations for different subjects. And that is being led by DEFRA and George Eustace rather than me, but it's a very active discussion with the Fisheries Commissioner and officials on all sides who are concerned. And actually it's quite a good, relatively constructive discussion. I think it has taken some of the sort of heat and complexity out of the situation. So we hope that we can find a good solution on that basis.
Thank you, Lord Frost.
Anne-Marie, would you like to ask the next question?
I would, thank you, Chairman. The UK's new relationship with the EU is built around the TCA Partnership Council and the specialised committees. Do you accept that there will be EU proposals not directly relating to these bodies that could impact and implicate the UK's vital national interests? For example, new EU rules on state aid. Would you agree that with government input, this committee should scrutinise those proposals?
So I think on the question of scrutiny and the role of this committee, I'm obviously happy to explain to the committee, any issue of political interest that comes up. I think on the formalities of scrutiny, we have made an offer, as it were, to you, and we're waiting for a response on the details of that. So I think I'd like to see what that is and continue those discussions. You raise an important issue, though, that important legislative decisions or proposals by the EU can affect the relationship between us, and things that the EU chooses to do for itself can have an effect on us. And of course that was the core of the level playing field discussions we had last year. As you say, there's a specialised committee to deal with that, and it's already had some quite interesting discussions on some issues.
Well, I throw into the pot on that one the fact that, of course, when Section 38 went through, there was another provision in the Act of Parliament which was passed on the same day. And that enabled the committee to be able, through a motion that I was able to put down, which people can look at, which gave us the right to be able to insist on a debate in the House of Commons on what were described as vital national interests. So that actually it seems that there's some sort of parallel arrangement with respect to what we had then, and also the need for us to be able to form a judgment about what may or may not be a matter of national interest in the light of the way in which these committees actually operate. So I'd like to just put that, if I may, on the table, because I do think that there is a parallel there where it's already been conceded by Act of Parliament itself.
Yes, Chair. I suppose I would say that without sort of running now the discussion that we probably need to have on scrutiny, I would say that obviously that particular provision, Section 29, was about the transition period and the continuing imposition of EU law without consent in this country. And then in those circumstances, obviously, Parliament should be able to debate and raise concerns about that. And I think that's what that section was about. And as regards EU law in Northern Ireland, we've obviously agreed enhanced scrutiny arrangements to reflect the fact that there's a similar sort of situation. But obviously be very happy to look at whatever proposals you make in that ongoing dialogue on scrutiny, which we want to make as open and useful as possible to both sides.
Moving on to the question of EU retained law, what is the proposed timing and scope of this review of EU retained law, which you're now engaged in? When do you think we'll be able to see more detail on the proposed review? And can we expect something on the substance before the end of the year? And how long do you envisage it would take to change or replace all the EU retained law that is not right for the UK? And also, what would be the methodology for doing it? I mean, in terms of constitutional arrangements.
So there's a lot there, Chairman.
There is.
And
in volume as well as in substance.
To answer your process question, I hope we will have something to say before the Christmas break by way of kind of preliminary assessment of some of the issues that have arisen. We're just sort of setting up the process now. I think the way I think of it is there are two aspects to this. One is, what's the status of the retained EU law? What is its status in the statute book? Why is it distinct? And what do we do about the question that I've raised before of laws that were passed at the EU level, have direct effect in this country? Perhaps we voted against them in Brussels. Nobody in this Parliament has ever voted on them, and yet here they are part of our statute book as primary legislation. And I think we have to do something about that situation. So that's the sort of status question. Can we find a way of regularising and reforming the status of EU law? There's then a substance question, which is all the actual areas, department by department, where this law has been brought onto the statute book. We need to do a mapping exercise, I suppose you would say, this autumn of that. Some departments have already begun reviews of their areas. For example, the Treasury, the Chancellor announced a few months ago there'll be a review of a lot of the financial services legislation that came in through EU law. But we need to do a mapping exercise of, where does this legislation sit on the statute book, and which are the most problematic areas, and then armed with that, and armed with, I hope, some thoughts about how we can change it, we can take it forward next year. So that's that's the sort of core of the proposal as we're taking it forward.
Well, I've been taking something of an interest in this for the last 36 years, because that's when I first came on this committee.
Yes.
And I have to say, and I'll put in the form of a question, would you not agree that if one was to have looked back to the way in which these laws were made, and the fact that they were made behind closed doors by consensus, so-called, because everybody knew what the outcome of the vote would be if there was to be one, and without even a transcript, and that is one of the most astonishing parts of this whole exercise. And then, of course, in the White Paper of 1971, it was absolutely clear, 71, before the Act of 1972 went through, that the decisions that were being taken were going to be on the basis of what was described as a veto, which was, as they put it, in our vital national interests, because otherwise, they said, we would destroy the fabric of the European community. That was the basis on which it was put. So a very high test was applied, and yet, bit by bit, the competences grew. So I would simply say that as we nodded them all through over those 36 years, I got more and more frustrated. That's why I put down my sovereignty clause back in 1986. But the real question is, given that, this issue of EU retained law surely does remain, does it not, a really massive issue of great significance in terms of self-government, and the Withdrawal Agreement Act actually includes a provision enabling the courts to be able to quash any proposals which are put forward for legislation, or indeed any act of parliament that's been passed, if they think that it's inconsistent with the principles of EU law. It's a bit of a mouthful, this, but for practical purposes, do you not agree that this is something of such importance, which goes to the heart of self-government, which goes to the heart of our constitutional principles and everything that we've talked about in terms of sovereignty?
I do agree with that. You're absolutely right, and I think probably many people will be surprised that we need to do a mapping exercise at all. After all, one likes to think the government knows what the laws are, and yet in fact it isn't entirely clear what EU laws have been brought onto the statute book, or at least is not easily known, and it requires quite a lot of research in some areas to work this out. Now, it's not an impossible task, and we'll do it, but it rather illustrates your point. I think the other thing I would say is that one of the problems with the EU setup is, the inability to correct error. It takes a long time to pass laws. They're very reluctant to change them, having done them, because it requires so much effort. One of the advantages we have is that we can proceed more nimbly than the EU can, and I draw from that the conclusion that we must be able to look at the inherited stock of EU legislation in a similarly nimble way if we're going to be able to get the benefits that we aim to from Brexit. So that's the spirit that we look at this in.
That's very interesting. And just finally on that point, I remember once upon a time when I was doing Jolovitz on the question of reform of the law of the Roman Empire, which is going back a very long time. Justinian actually managed to achieve it in 5 years. I hope and believe that we'll be able to do it in a lot shorter time than that. So if we could move now to Gibraltar. David, you were going to ask a question. This is the last question.
Yes. Gibraltar. The government's recently opened negotiations with the EU over Gibraltar. Back in July, both the UK and the Gibraltar governments made clear that the EU's negotiating mandate would undermine sovereignty in respect of Gibraltar. What has changed since then?
So a bit has changed, but not enough. We did, as is well known, we did a political deal at the end of last year with the EU over Gibraltar that provides the sort of basis for how things are currently working. We now need to put that into legal form, and the EU's mandate, as you rightly say, the Commission's draft wasn't in line with that deal, and so gave us some problems. That has now gone through the Council, and I think one aspect of it has changed, which is that the EU has agreed that Frontex will be the body that's involved in policing aspects of entry to the Schengen area via Gibraltar, and not Spain in that. However, that's not the only problem. That was one of the most visible ones. It's not the only one. Once again, as is its wont, the EU is looking for more extensive alignment, a role for the Court of Justice, which wasn't in the December deal, and so on. I mean, the usual sort of playbook, really, and that's what we've got to now work through with them as the negotiations begin. And that is a negotiation that the Foreign Office are leading, but obviously I and my team take a very close interest in it, because there's all sorts of read-acrosses, even if the underlying situations between Gibraltar and elsewhere are very, very different.
Has the EU in any sense scaled back its proposals for a substantial body of EU law to apply in relation to trading goods in Gibraltar?
So it doesn't look like it at the moment. Again, we're just beginning the discussion, so let's see. It's not unknown for a kind of mandate to be much broader than the real sort of core of interest to the EU when they're written. I mean, the final solution has got to take account of the fact that Gibraltar hardly produces any goods. It's not a great manufacturing centre. The arrangements need to reflect that reality, and it doesn't make sense to impose large chunks of essentially irrelevant EU law and kind of policing arrangements via the courts and the institutions and so on that make no meaningful sense in Gibraltar. And I like to think, actually, we usually do find solutions on Gibraltar in the end, and I hope that in this case we'll be able to do the same. I just hope we don't take excessively long over it.
How concerned are you that any agreement in relation to Gibraltar may not be a rerun of the Northern Ireland Protocol?
So there are obviously aspects of it that are, raise similar sorts of problems, clearly, but I think the differences are more marked than the similarities. Gibraltar has never been part of the UK's customs territory, for example. It was never part of the EU's customs territory for goods either. So the whole politics of it is very different to Northern Ireland. That said, some of the, as I've just been saying, some of the things that are in the mandate raise similar kinds of problems. But I think the underlying situations are so different and raise such different real-world issues that in real life the read across from one to the other is not that great.
Are you concerned that the Spanish may exercise a veto in respect of whatever agreement you may arrive at with the European Union over Gibraltar?
So, I mean, one has to foresee any possible eventuality, but I think at the moment and for the last year or two, the relationship with Spain has been good. They have been constructive in these sort of talks. We wouldn't have got to the deal at the end of last year without constructive approach by Spain, and that is continuing as far as we can tell. Obviously, we don't know what gets said within the EU Council, but as far as we can tell, Spain has been very constructive over this, and that's extremely good. It hasn't always been like this over Gibraltar, but it's very good that it is at the moment, and I hope we can. That's one of the reasons why I think we probably can find a way through on this.
Thank you.
Just one last point on that, which is that we have the pleasure of having Mr. Picardo, QC, Chief Minister, coming to see us in a few weeks' time. So we'll be able to carry that conversation on with him as well. Good. Well, that concludes the proceedings at our end, Lord Frost. Thank you very much for coming, and it's been informative and very useful. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
The proceeding is currently in private. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.